Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. As a representative of the Italian Carabinieri Corps and member of the Coespu, Center of Excellence for Stability Police Units, I'm proud to be here and grateful for the IOM for giving me the opportunity to be here. Before moving to the main topic of my intervention, I want to spend some words introducing me, my police force, my gendarmerie force, and my center. My corps, the Carabinieri in Italy, represents a police force with a gendarmerie status. And together with the national police, we daily fight all forms of crimes, even the most noxious like trafficking. I'm a member of the Carabinieri. I'm a major with 20 years I serve for 20 years now. And for this reason, I consider myself, first of all, a police officer, despite the fact that currently I'm a teacher of human rights in my Center of Excellence for Stability Police Unit. The Carabinieri were founded in 1814, so more than two centuries ago, and thanks to their peculiar experience as police force at national level and also in peacekeeping context, Italy in 2005 decided to create a center to support the international effort to deploy police officer in peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping operations. The Coespu's training efforts aim to prepare police peacekeepers specialized in managing the transition from a post-crisis situation to a stable environment for reconstruction to a people and community-oriented approach. In 14 years of activity of my center, we trained more than 11,000 police officers coming from more than 115 different countries. So it's a huge number. And consistently with the goal of training these international police officers to face the many challenges of a UN peace operation and also to better serve within their national borders, a constant part of our training programs have been dedicated to trafficking, to human trafficking, especially due to the Resolution 2331 issued by the Security Council in 2016 that requires as mandatory a specific training in trafficking for the new peacekeepers. Trafficking is usually addressed in my center with several theoretical sections and practical exercises. But more recently, together with the main international organizations like OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and European Union, we organize and conduct multi-agency live exercises to reproduce possible trafficking scenarios and allow participants to experience a realistic simulation in a multinational and interagency environment. What is the aim of these efforts? The aim is to disseminate the awareness about the phenomenon, to create knowledge over the crime, because the phenomenon and the crime are not the same thing according to my perception, and develop professional skills to tackle it in international context and even at national levels. We want to achieve the objective that the police officers, the trained police officers, but also the participants from other agencies, prosecutors, social workers, interpreters, doctors, psychologists, are trained to combat human trafficking locally, nationally, internationally, of course, and develop the expertise to work cohesively, okay, together, each one in his field of expertise, towards recognizing community human trafficking issues, free victims of human trafficking, and bring, of course, traffickers to justice. Anti-trafficking training is even more important now for us as Center for for peacekeepers if we take into account that more and more frequently the UN police is involved in capacity building programs. So the UN police is in charge of training, mentoring, advising the police, the security forces institutions in countries where the peacekeeping mission are deployed. So that's absolutely paramount to train in anti-trafficking. But coming back to the core topic of my intervention, please, next slide. I have to say that as a police officer with a specific experience in investigating serious crime, I investigated crimes for more than 12 years before to become a trainer. I faced several times the problems related to this phenomenon. And even as a trainer, in the last 4 years, what I've noticed is that, unfortunately, there is a general lack of awareness of the problem, even among senior police officers. The big gap is not only limited to the knowledge or the legal instruments, but the definition of trafficking, but even the necessity to safeguard the victims or the possible victims. I have many colleagues at national and at international level that are not aware at all of the problem. That's very sad. For that reason, I've structured my presentation on the following key points. Can you go back to the previous slide? Previous slide, please. Okay. With my intervention, I would like first to recall the international legal terms. I know that probably you have already spoken about the legal terms, so I will be very quick, very fast. Then I would like to analyze the characteristics of trafficking as a phenomenon that usually follows certain paths and is, of course, influenced by certain external factors. These paths and these factors render us to investigate the crime really tough. And if you are an expert in investigating human trafficking in Italy, you cannot easily apply your expertise in another country. That's my experience. In the last part of my presentation, I'll consider the ways a police force usually face the crime, highlighting the common investigative challenges and the difficulties that usually a police force encounters in dealing with the victims and trying to protect them. I will bring my personal experience in that part. And I know for sure that perhaps colleagues from different realities will have different point of views from me. But it's important to share, I guess. Now, okay, that's the correct slide. What is human trafficking? I said it's still unclear, even among police officers, as this is said. When in the courses that we run in the Coespu, when I speak about trafficking, the first thing I do is asking to my colleague, what do you think? What is human trafficking? And can you go forwards? If we stay on this definition that trafficking is a ruthless crime, that trafficking exploits millions of vulnerable people, every representative of any police force worldwide agree with this definition. But if we try to dig a little bit further in the definition about what is human trafficking, that's the point where the different cultures and the different backgrounds emerge. Even almost 20 years later that the Palermo protocols, addictional protocols, have been adopted. I've noticed that the perception of what is trafficking still remain different due to the different cultures, different social backgrounds. At least when we speak with people that is not directly involved in its context. What I mean, that if I speak with someone that belongs to a special unit, anti-trafficking units, no problem at all. If I speak with a normal police officer, for instance, a police officer that is in the traffic division, he doesn't know anything about trafficking. And this is absolutely sad because this is not the best way to address the problem. Next slide, please. It's not the best way because Trafficking is a complex phenomenon and it's a complex crime. It involves different types of criminal activities and non-criminal activities that all together lead to a situation of exploitation. Fortunately, at international level, now we have the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and its additional protocols. And it has a paramount importance. The Convention represents a recognition by the international community of a need to commit into a common effort to fight against serious forms of crimes. And trafficking has been recognized as among these serious forms of crimes. Next slide, please. The intention of the protocol, anti-trafficking protocol, but also of the entire convention, is to facilitate the convergence in national approaches with regard to establishment of domestic criminal offenses, of course, and then to support efficient international cooperation in investigating and prosecuting trafficking in persons cases. And the additional objective of the protocols, and I would say the most important, is to protect and assist the victims of trafficking in person with a full respect for their human rights. Could you pass to the next slide, please? I'm just quoting the additional protocols. I put Article 3 just because it's important to remember what is the definition. I don't want to read it, but we need the three famous elements to speak about trafficking. Could you go to the next slide, please? Next one. Thank you. So I said before, trafficking is a complex crime because it is linked to a complex phenomenon. And it is composed by multiple elements, and all these elements must concur to realize the crime of trafficking. Otherwise, we have something else. Could you click a couple of times? So to speak about trafficking, we need the three constitutive elements. We need the activity, the means, and the purpose. The activity is what is done. The means, how it is done, and the purpose, why. If we don't have all three of them, we don't have trafficking, unfortunately. Next, please. Then, while dealing with trafficking, as investigators also, we have to take into consideration not only the legal definitions and the legal part of its constitutive elements, but we have to consider it as a dynamic phenomenon. It's paramount to take it into consideration. We say dynamic phenomenon because it usually has a place of origin, a place or places of transit, and a place of destination. As an investigator, I have to take into account that Italy is usually a place of destination. I have to set up my investigation. I have to allocate the resources taking into account this factor. And the geographic area in which it is perpetrated, the crime, could be, and often is, very wide, transnational or even transcontinental. This factor renders many times the crime a transnational one, with the necessity of international cooperation. And it's very tough to collaborate with different countries, believe me. Also, the time frame during which it is perpetrated could last for a long, very long time. From the recruitment of the victim to the actual exploitation could pass months. And before the crime is detected, and before the intervention in favor of the victims, could pass even years. Imagine for an investigator to gather the evidence, to reconstruct what happened in months of years of history of this victim. It's really a tough job, sometimes impossible, unfortunately. Next one, please. Another element to take into consideration is that trafficking phenomenon is deeply influenced by external factors. So-called environmental factors of the place of origin, transit, and destination have a great impact on the phenomenon, and to consider them is paramount for an effective anti-trafficking prevention and contrast. We usually group these elements into push, pull, and facilitating factors. Push factors are those that drive the victim into the hands of traffickers. Poverty, lack of access to resources, marginalization of certain part of the society, like women or children, unemployment, poor education, could represent push factors that push the victims in the hands of the traffickers. Pull factors are those that attract the victims in a certain place. Request for prostitution. In Italy, for instance, it's one of the major pull factors that attracts victims of trafficking, sadly. The pull factors offers trafficker exploitative opportunities. I already said huge demand of services of trafficked victims. Each country, but even inside the same country, we could have different pull factors. We could have different way the trafficker exploit the victims. Yesterday, I was speaking with Sarah, another colleague coming from Italy, and different place. I never served in that part of Italy. She told me that in that area of Italy, they have the problem of forced begging. I never experienced forced begging as a trafficking purpose. I always experienced forced labor or forced exploitation of prostitution. That is really important to remember that each locality, each nation has its own problem with trafficking. And you should take into account that while investigating and even while dealing with victims or taking care of them. Then we have facilitating factors that are there just to render a trafficker life easier. What could be a facilitating factor? Modernization of travel system, reduced cost of traveling, even the use of the communication, the easy way to communicate with a smartphone. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list of factors. And the way I've categorized them is not strict, is not blocked, because in some reality, a push factor could become a pull factor, and vice versa, okay? So something that represents a push or a facilitating factor somewhere could represent a pull factor in another country, in another location. Next slide, please. Could you click again? Okay. Now we have a common definition of what is trafficking. I remember what is the definition given by the protocol. We have clear which are the necessary constitutive elements to define something as trafficking. But from this point forward, things are getting more complicated. I describe trafficking as a dynamic phenomenon and complex phenomenon, and therefore we have a complex crime to tackle. That's because we have numerous separate abuses committed during the course of trafficking, which themselves can violate both national or international law. And it's only the combination of the elements that allow trafficking to be considered as an overall crime which is distinct from each single violation. Next, please. So we have spoken about dynamicity, we have spoken about factors and characteristics of trafficking. All these factors and characteristics render trafficking an hidden crime, unfortunately. Its composite nature often makes it difficult to detect for the police forces. It can easily be confused or misperceived with some of its constitutive elements. It's a fact. Security forces many times intervene investigating just a crime appearing on the surface. Just one of the elements. For them it's okay. I already done my job. I'm prosecuting, I'm bringing a case in front of the court for sexual exploitation, I'm okay. There's no necessity to look forward, to investigate more. That's wrong. Just to cite a few examples, I invite you to think about crimes like domestic violence. Could be consequence of trafficking, forced marriage, or domestic labor, easily. Irregular work could be a case of trafficking and forced labor. Prostitution. Many, many cases of prostitution hide sexual exploitation, trafficking and sexual exploitation. Even other crimes like kidnapping or situation of disappearing, people disappearing, could hide one of the means of a trafficking case without the exploitation. Okay, go back, thank you. After everything I said, I guess it's clear to everybody that to investigate trafficking cases, it's very tough. Actually, there are three types of investigating approaches that a law enforcement agency can use. We could say there are a proactive, a reactive, and also a disruptive approach. Each one of these approaches can successfully lead to victims being identified and protected and assisted. But the effectiveness in tackling the crime, in dismantling the responsible criminal organization is not always the same, unfortunately. I want to start from the first one, the easier for the police forces, the reactive response. It usually stems out from a contact with the victim or with the surface crime. In this situation, the police is not directly looking for a trafficking case. Instead, it's just preventing criminality. This is a victim-led approach, which is reliant almost of all on victim testimony. Consistently, this approach utilizes standards and I would say quite basic police criminal investigation methods. These methods are usually corroboration, identification parades, photo identification, and so forth. So very, very basic. The second way, the proactive one, is different from the reactive. It's an intelligence-generated or a police-led approach. With a proactive approach, the police is specifically looking for a trafficking case. Police have initial elements that suggest the existence of a trafficking case, and the investigators try to corroborate the initial inferences. So they have some suspects. They have conducted some analysis. Like Sebastian was saying, the use of technological tools could indicate, could lead you to look in some part of the country, to look in some specific city, and then you start digging, because you know that probably there's trafficking there. This is a proactive way to approach the problem. It entails the possibility to start a trafficking investigation even before the identification of any possible victim, even before that the existence of a victim has been proved. You know that there are indicators, you start investigating. You are not sure that your investigation will lead to the identification of a real case, but that's the way you have to proactively approach the problem. This approach, this way to act, does not depend solely on victim testimony or cooperation. Rather, it relies on utilizing a combination of tools to collect evidence and build circumstances. Technical means in this type of approach are very important. The gathering of information to prove the existence of the constitutive elements of the crime can be done through electronic surveillance, such as wiretapping, video surveillance, analysis of open sources like the internet, screening for sex advices on the internet, it's paramount. And even the so-called human intelligence techniques are very important. The use of the also known police informants represent an important tool for the police. This type of approach is for sure more effective in targeting the single perpetrators and also the criminal groups. But, I have to say but, it requires a bigger effort from the security institution. Personnel, professionally skilled, resources in terms of equipment, and of course is time consuming. You need months to build up a case in a proactive way. The last approach is the disruptive one. It represents a coordinated multi-agency approach at the problem. Within this coordinated multi-agency approach, the police initiatives, the investigation, are just a part of a bigger common effort, okay? A coordinated bigger common effort. This type of approach is influenced by an initial risk assessment, a deep analysis of the phenomenon, and is aimed at ensuring the protection of victims and the dismantling of criminal organization, and also to tackle the root causes of the phenomenon locally, nationally, possibly internationally. The dynamics and the nature of the crime are, of course, taken into consideration. The police, but even the governmental institutions that coordinate this type of efforts, have to take into consideration the dynamics locally and the push-pull facilitating factors to coordinate the activities. This approach is, of course, effective, is efficient in dismantling the organization behind trafficking and also at addressing the factors, the so-called root causes which generate and facilitate the phenomenon. This option, easy to say, is the best one. Represent the best possible option, the best possible way to tackle the problem, to prosecute the crime, to address the entire phenomenon. But, unfortunately, I have to highlight that the police cannot alone generate this type of approach. Police, enforcement agencies can only be part of it. Italy recently has applied a national plan that involves all the stakeholders. And I think it's working. It's working. We are obtaining results, good results. Next part, please. And this is the last part, final part of our intervention. In this part, I want to highlight some of the common difficulties and challenges that the police face while dealing with trafficking situation, at least from my perspective of Italian police officer. Sorry, I know that perhaps if you belong to different realities, some problem could be not a problem for you, but this is my perspective, and I guess it's important to share the perspective of each one of us. I have to say that the most common difficulty that the police encounter is the identification of a trafficking case. What we have heard this morning, it's from Maria, it's a clear example. This is especially true when the police applies a reactive approach at the crime. There is a lack of awareness of the problem. There's lack of appropriate skills to investigate the cases and handle the victims, and that led many situations of trafficking unprosecuted. When the police proceed because a crime has been committed, there are difficulties to look beyond the appearing crime. Therefore, we have many prosecutions, at least in Italy, for sex crimes, for irregular labor, or other crimes that really represents only elements of a trafficking case. And this difficulty to identify the crime led us usually to another major problem, that is the difficulty to identify the victims. We know that victims many times are brainwashed, are threatened by traffickers, and they fear the contact with the police. Sometimes they don't self-identify as trafficking target. And when they enter into contact with the police or with the institutions, in many cases, they consider themselves as criminals. And sadly, also the police look at them only as criminals. There are many cases: prostitution, public begging, illegal crossing borders, pickpocketing. These are all examples of crimes committed by possible victims of trafficking, many times forced to do so, forced to commit crime. So I usually invite my students, my trainees, police officers, to look beyond the appearing, to dig further. Even when trafficking victims recognize to be targets of a crime, they don't realize to be victims of trafficking. They believe of being prey of just one of the other seen appearing crimes. So they don't arrive to the police and they say, hey, I am victim of trafficking. That's up to the police to identify them as victims. We are like doctors. When you go to the doctors, you don't know the diagnosis. You say, I'm feeling sick, and the doctor has exactly to look for the disease, to give a name. That's the job for the police. Another problem that usually police institutions have is that they still confuse trafficking with migrant smuggling. I don't want to quote the anti-smuggling protocol, but it's clear, I guess, what is the difference. So it is pivotal for law enforcement to proactively seek out victims, keeping in mind to look for indicators of trafficking. I know that there will be a specific section about trafficking signs. So I just want to remember signs of traumas, abuses, absence of documents, bad living condition, restriction of freedoms, isolation, are all possible signs of a case of trafficking. Police should be trained to conduct screening interviews based on questions that may determine the presence of the constitutive elements of trafficking, so the activity, the means, and the purpose. All these challenges, all these difficulties I mentioned are even more evident if the police intervenes when the exploitation isn't already occurred. For instance, during an attempted abduction or during a transit phase. In Italy, we have a big problem with illegal immigration. When we intervene, we arrest the smugglers, but we know for sure that among the illegal immigrants, there are many possible victims of trafficking, but we don't have the elements to prove it. We don't have the manpower to investigate each case one by one, because it requires a lot of time. Actually, just to remember, according to the Trafficking in Person Protocol, exploitation does not have to occur for the crime of trafficking to take place. But, of course, it's really hard to prove the exploitative intent of the traffickers if you don't use technological tools. So it's really, really hard. Could you pass to the next one? Okay, thank you. Among the other challenges, I want to mention that there is the necessity to tackle this crime of advanced investigation techniques that are not always available or sustainable by the countries, by the law enforcement agencies. There is a general lack of technological tools and even technological skills of the personnel. What I've noticed, and now Italy is, while investigating trafficking, is really looking into the commercial part of trafficking. So while we investigate, we try to obtain, to corroborate the situation, gathering the necessary evidence through the components related to the advertising. For instance, that could be part of the recruitment and exploitation process, transportation, communication, even to look into the financial transactions of the traffickers is absolutely important. But to exploit these sources of evidence require highly professionally trained personnel. And to train personnel in this way is really tough. There is always a lack of resources, a lack of manpower, and so on. Another obstacle that I would like to bring up on the table is the lack of adequate legislative tools. I mean, after almost 20 years of the adoption of the additional protocols, the criminalization of trafficking is taken for granted. When I speak about legislative tools, I speak about the tools that can help the police to investigate. I mean, the possibility to have long-term investigation permissions, the possibility to obtain special warrants to investigate. At least in Italy, I guess we are lucky because, or unlucky, because dealing with organized crime, mafia, since the 80s and the 90s, we developed special procedures to deal with serious crimes. And when we implemented our anti-trafficking legislation, we just added trafficking among the serious crime. So we were really lucky in this situation. I said that trafficking sometimes is an international issue, and that requires that the joint operation with foreign police forces, and this is extremely difficult to work at the transnational level. There are, first of all, many times language barriers, and there is an absence of an efficient coordinating structures that often hinders the necessary cooperation. Okay. Next, please. Okay. Dealing with victims or possible victims is an issue for the police. That's why I already introduced the topic. Victims sometimes have committed crimes. That's because there is the necessity of interpreters, reliable interpreters, cultural mediators, professional consultants, and they should be trained to work with the police. They should be trained to work in trafficking cases, but they should be trained to work with the police. And the police should be trained to work with them. Otherwise, they impede the work of each other. Okay. It's absolutely paramount. Police then should work with the victims in order to obtain the best possible cooperation. But that's not always possible. We know that trafficking cases are more easily prosecuted when victims cooperate with law enforcement. But the cooperation, compared with the cooperation for other crimes, is limited. Many are the reasons. We know, for instance, you have already spoken about the reasons why victims are not cooperating sometimes. But one lesson learned is that the better the support system, protection and assistance provided to victims is, the more likely they are to participate with law enforcement efforts. Another issue when we deal with victims is that, of course, the priority is always to protect and safeguard them. But in many cases, the necessity to intervene in protection of victims before that the necessary evidence are gathered entails the risk of jeopardizing an entire operation, entails the risk, entails the possibility to lose the opportunity to dismantle an organization and to prosecute the perpetrators. So that's sometimes really challenging for the police and the prosecutors to decide if it is necessary to intervene in favor of the victims, or if it is better to leave the victims in the hands of traffickers to gather more evidence. So it's one of the very tough challenges. Next, please. During trafficking investigations, the investigators are responsible of identifying, assessing, and managing the risks posed to victims. In this context, risk refers to all the threats to the security or safety of individuals before and after the rescue of them. That is particularly true, as I was saying before, when during the investigation the police decide to postpone the rescue of the victims to gain the necessary time to gather evidence for the constitutive elements of trafficking, and therefore assure the prosecution of all the perpetrators. There are many risks that the victim may encounter even after they have been rescued, okay? And they may especially be heightened when victims agree to assist with prosecutorial efforts. The safety of the victims and their family is always paramount. And once they have intervened to rescue the victim, the investigators and the prosecutor have the duty to be honest and open with them at all times. Next slide, please. Victims should fully understand the relevant issues, responsibility, and potential consequences and risks attached to any decision that they may be asked to make. They should be made aware that cooperation with the prosecution may involve many elements of risk to them and their families. And they should be informed of all protection measures available so that they can take informed decision. It's paramount to be honest with the victims, so they can represent a kind of, they can spread the message that you can rely on the police, you can rely on the institution. That's very important for the other victims. I guess the time at my disposal is almost ended, but next slide, please. I want just to remember that the effort to ensure the appropriate protection measures should focus on what and who is at risk, what is the risk, what is the level of risk, and what action should be taken by the police. And investigators should ensure that the risks in each case are assessed from the outset, and the assessment is continuously reviewed and updated. And lastly, while dealing with victim security, even when the victims have already testified, the duty of care does not end with the end of the trial. And it is necessary to work for the police, to strictly work in support of other stakeholders that are in charge of the victim assistance. That's conclude my presentation, my intervention. I hope that in this brief period of time I was able to propose you a vision of the topic from a different angle, perhaps a more police-oriented, Italian-oriented one, but different from the other speakers. My final consideration, you could go to the last slide, please. Next. Thank you. My final consideration is that to effectively combat human trafficking at local, national, international level, it is necessary to act with a coordinated multi-agency approach. It's the best way to proceed. Therefore, remains paramount to establish awareness and investigative training programs, empowering law enforcement agencies, but also first responders, other government entities, with the knowledge and expertise to work, again, cohesively towards recognizing community human trafficking issues, free victims of human trafficking, and, after all, bring traffickers to justice. And that's end my intervention. I really thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.